Hello, Milwaukee Lutheran Church. Morning, afternoon. I don't know when you're finally getting this. It's me. Hey, first off, I wanted to apologize for getting the word out so late. It's a bit of a long story, but I'll do my best to compress it for the purposes of storytelling. So Alen ran her marathon last week, and she qualified for Boston. By the way, she ran a fantastic time. She ran a 3:35:25, which is amazing, and yes, faster than my time by a significant margin. So she's officially the fastest person in the household now. A title that I probably will not regain. Anyways, she ran the marathon. Was depleted in energy, as you can probably expect. But then Tuesday started to get a sore throat. She tested, came back negative. Same thing Wednesday, Thursday, and then Friday finally tested positive for COVID. And as soon as we found out, she isolated, um, locked herself in her room, basically locked herself in her office. We ventilated. I wore a mask. She wore a mask. The whole 9 yards. And I tested every day as well too. Took a test Friday, negative. Took a test Saturday. Took a PCR test Saturday, negative, negative. And I had my fingers crossed, hoping that I dodged a bullet. Felt great. And then this morning I woke up and had a little bit of congestion, which is kind of normal for me. I always wake up with a stuffy nose and all that wonderful stuff. And I took a shower, and I came out of the shower, and I don't know if you have a similar feeling, but when you've just got that sense, you're like, everything's not quite right. And I had that sense, and so I went and I took a self an at home test, and it came back negative. And I was like, good Lord, I mean, part of me was really hoping it would be positive, if only to affirm what I was experiencing. Went back, looked at my test again, held it up to the light, kind of tilted it, and I could see a faint line. I was like, I should probably do another one. I took another one, and this time it was much more conclusive. And I was like, yeah, this is affirming what I'd been experiencing. So now, in hindsight, when we found out Alen was positive, I was like, I'm like, should I cancel today? And I was like, but I don't know. I wasn't sick. I was hoping that everything would pan out. But in hindsight, I kind of wish that I would have spread the word earlier, so it wasn't so last minute. So I apologize for the nature of things. But man, if you would have told me 2 years ago that I'd be canceling worship service the morning of because I had a little bit of head congestion, boy, I would have told you you're crazy. I mean, I'm looking back at all the times that I came to Sunday morning feeling much worse than I do right now. And if you really think about it, maybe it's a good thing that times have changed. And I think back, and I wonder, how many times did I get people sick, right? Because I showed up to church with what I felt was a cold, right? And that was just the culture. You power through it. You as my dad would say, rub some dirt on it, keep on going. But I think maybe this is for the better, that I don't risk infecting anybody else. So hope you're all doing well. Again, apologies for the late notice. Right now, I don't know what the plan is for next Sunday. I've been consulting folks. Theoretically, I should isolate for 5 days after my initial symptoms, which would be from today. So theoretically, I can be going outside next week, but realistically, I'm guessing what I'll probably end up doing is either trying to get pulpit supply, or we'll do a virtual worship for next Sunday. Apologies to skip out on two Sundays worth of stuff, but again, I'd much rather have this than have you guys getting sick because of me. So, all right, I'm just gonna record a quick sermon today. Quick being the operative words. This is the other piece of it, is that I was really excited for the sermon I was going to preach today. Well, that I am going to preach today. And it's always, when you've got your best stuff, that this kind of thing happens. Not that this thing happens often, but It's never when you've got, you don't feel prepared at all. There's never a way out from that. It's always when you've got your best stuff prepped. Um, but I'll leave that judgment up to you. Mayhap when I think I've got my best stuff, you guys are like, boy, the super boring one, Jesse. I don't know. All right, I'll get on with it. I'm not going to keep you here all day. So the text I was actually going to preach on, I am going to preach on today, is the Galatians text, the second reading for today, which I was really excited about because I have not preached on the epistle in a long, long time, and now 2 weeks in a row I would be preaching on the second reading. So I'll read Galatians 3. The other readings for today, if you wanted to go and read them, are Isaiah 65, 1 through 9. By the way, I'm gonna be attaching the bulletin for this week, just so you have it. And then the gospel reading for today is from Luke, I believe. Man, my internet is slow as molasses. Luke 8, 26 through 39. But like I said, I'm preaching on the Galatians text. So this is Galatians chapter 3, 23 through 29. And Paul writes to the church in Galatia, "Now, before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith would be revealed. Therefore, the law was our disciplinarian until Christ came so that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer subject to a disciplinarian, for in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. As many of you were baptized into Christ, have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise." Here ends the reading. So, what I was going to do is I was going to ask you all to converse amongst yourselves. You dodged a bullet, see? You didn't have to talk to each other. I was going to ask you all to converse amongst yourselves and discuss a time in your life when you felt like you had mastered a skill. So, a time in your life when you feel like you have moved beyond the point where, the basic lessons no longer needed to be repeated, where you transcended your basic learning. And I was going to have you, share those experiences with each other. So when I think about that experience, the first thing that pops into my mind is downhill skiing. The first time I went downhill skiing, I think I was 14. My dad took my brother and I, after we had begged him, my dad took my brother and I over to Sylvan Mountain, and mountain should be in scare quotes here, in central northern Michigan. It's a large hill. It's not a mountain. It's not even a large hill. It's a hill, which for northern Michigan is a mountain. Or for Michigan is a mountain, I should say. So he took us over to Sylvan Resort, and we rented skis. My dad brought his old skis from 1970 with, they were the straight as an arrow, with the boots that only had one latch on them. He brought that all the way over. My brother and I got to rent brand new parabolic skis, which that was just getting to be a big thing at that point in time. And he didn't give us a whole lot of instruction. He showed us how to snowplow, which I only did for maybe 1 or 2 runs down before he got bored. And then I just started doing my thing. And I loved it, man. From the first turn I made, I was in seventh heaven. And I thought I was a pretty darn good skier day one. But the thing about skiing, for those of you who have done it, is that skiing is, number one, about making it down the hill in one piece. Speed may or may not factor in there, but really what skiing is primarily about is looking good while you're doing it. And as you ski year after year after year, you begin to develop an eye for who looks good while skiing. And I don't mean physical attractiveness. I mean who has good technique. And to be fair, there's a reason that you develop good technique while skiing. It's because good technique means you're a better skier, which means that you can navigate more difficult terrain. But I'll get to that more later. But the way that I learned to ski was kind of patchwork. I got a lot of advice from different people, This is kind of pre-days of YouTube, so I couldn't exactly look up YouTube videos, but I got a lot of advice from different people, from experienced skiers. And essentially now, having skied for 30 years, the general strategy for me boils down to this. So primary, number one, most important thing, seems counterintuitive. Make sure your shoulders are always pointed downhill or in the direction of travel. Okay, most important, number one. There's a reason for that, which I'm not going to get into. The point of this is not to discuss skiing theory, but keep your shoulders pointed downhill. When you want to initiate a turn, initiate it with a pole plant. You turn around the pole. Keep your knees flexed so that you can absorb any terrain changes. As you enter into the turn, make sure that your weight is on your downhill ski. There are a million little other things that are involved as well too, like try to stay forward over the tips of your skis unless you're going through deep snow, in which case you want to sit back a little bit. Although with the new modern skis, the big wide ones, that's not so crucial. If you sense a change in terrain coming, really make extra sure that your knees are flexed. Keep your shoulders pointed downhill, because in that way you actually will be able to control your speed better. As you can tell, there are a whole host of rules that are attached to learning to ski downhill. And what you're really aiming for is internalizing these rules to such an extent, building them into the memory of your muscles to such an extent that you can do all of these things simultaneously without thinking about it. Okay? Hopefully this bears some similarity to your experience of the question that I asked you of what it felt like to master a skill, right? To transcend the basic rules that you had been taught. And this skill could be anything. It could be a sports-related skill, could be a job-related skill. I know for people that have gotten really good at golf, there's a lot of this involved in golf as well too. Is like, repeating and repeating your golf swing over and over and over again, always perfecting it. To the point where you don't have to think about every little idiosyncrasy. Now, what does this have to do with Galatians? Oh, I'm glad you asked. So, this Galatians text, great, fantastic, wonderful piece of scripture. One of my favorites. I say that way far too often. Okay, but this Galatians text is Paul outlining a really interesting idea, which is basically this idea that what following Jesus is about transcending the basic rules that you grew up with, okay? And he's essentially creating this contrast, which is the contrast between what he identifies as the law versus what he identifies as faith, okay? Now, this text is hugely important for Lutheran theology. This is one of those texts that underpins our basic theology. Of course, we talk significantly about, faith and grace over law, greater than works. So this is one of those pieces. But I think there's more nuance to be read into this. Now, there are some interesting word choices that Paul uses here. For example, in verse 24, he refers to the fact that the law was our disciplinarian. Okay? Now, the word that we translate as disciplinarian is actually a derivative of the word pedagogue or pedagogy, which are two words that we have adapted into our English language. And of course, if you're familiar with these words, you know that pedagogy means to teach. Now, as you probably suspect, there's a little bit more contextual information that bears relevance here, which is that the root word here, pedagogue, in Koine Greek, actually referred to a specific person, to a specific role. And it's from this person, from this role, that we then developed, that we then pulled, this word to eventually mean teaching, and especially teaching of children, okay? Which, pedagogy is the discussion of learning and teaching, okay? So a pedagogue in Greek society during Paul's time was a person, an individual, most often was a slave of a Greek household. And again, keep in mind that slavery, again, we talked about this last week in Adult Ed, different concept, than what we operate with as citizens of the United States, of what we did to the peoples of Africa. and the Caribbean in dragging them forcefully to, it's different than that. Generally, what a slave meant in Greek society was somebody that was a member of a household, often, indebted to that household in one way or another. But it was a slightly different social standing, in other words. But this person, this pedagogue, was directly responsible for basically being a guide, a guard, and a mentor to a child within that household. So, and by the way, by child, we mean boys. Girls were not often educated. They didn't go to school in the same way that boys did. That's a conversation on the side, but just be aware of that. But when a boy was old enough to begin his educational process, he would be assigned a pedagogue. And that pedagogue was responsible for several things. Like I said, they were a mentor, so they would help reinforce the learnings that this boy was experiencing. And of course, in that society, you weren't just learning reading, writing, and arithmetic. You were learning potentially warfare, rhetoric, philosophy, all kinds of stuff. So that pedagogue was there to help tutor even in those scenarios. But really the primary role of a pedagogue was to make sure that the child learned, which meant guarding them and guiding them on their way to school if they were going to an external school. A lot of children were schooled in the household. But they basically followed this child around 24/7. And in Greek society during this time, a young boy was essentially in this situation up until they were considered old enough to be an adult, to become a man, right? And at that point, they no longer needed a pedagogue, right? And this marked essentially the adulthood right for a boy in Greek society, was that you were an adult when you no longer needed the pedagogue, and vice versa, right? So this is really cool because this is the metaphor that Paul is using to describe the role of the law with regards to our relationship to God. Paul says we were imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith could be revealed. So if you're tracking this metaphor, what Paul seems to be saying is that the law serves a purpose up until a point. And the law essentially is a pedagogue. It's there to help reinforce the rules of the world that we grow up in, to help teach us things that are vital for our survival and vital for our well-being. It's not useless. It's not without purpose, but it has a role. And at some point, you need to transcend that role. At some point, in order to move into the realm of adulthood, you need to move past the point where you no longer need that pedagogue, or as as we translate it here, I should say, the disciplinarian. Okay, and when Paul marks that, he says this transition between needing a pedagogue and moving on, he says that's when you move into the realm of faith. If you're to look at this text, you can split it into two parts, 23 through 26, and then 27 through 29. And notice the other thing that he identifies here is then when you finally are at this point where you operate under faith, the most important thing that comprises that movement into faith is the knowledge of the universality of being a child of God. Okay, I'll come back to that. I'm going to go back to my skiing metaphor. Okay, so in the process of learning to ski, all of these various movements, internalizing them, making them muscle memory to the point where you do it without thinking about it, right? It is so that you look good, don't get me wrong. But it's more important to that. It's about the other piece, which is making it down the hill safely and being able to navigate more and different and more challenging terrain. So I'm going to tell you a story that relates to this. I have been skiing since I was 14-ish, and I'm 40 now, which means I've been skiing for 26 odd years. Long time, okay. One of my favorite types of skiing is what they refer to as off-piste, stealing the French word, so off-the-track skiing, which means that you're going down runs that are not groomed. And it may include trees and or impromptu moguls, impromptu bumps, may involve cliffs and all kinds of stuff. Sounds scary, right? And usually it isn't. Usually it's just a ton of fun and exciting because when you've got a really good snow day, you've gotten a lot of light, fluffy snow, it can be the most relaxed form of skiing ever. Anybody that has had a good powder day where you're just floating from turn to turn, you're not even hardly working. You are just smoothly sailing the seas of powder, right? However, you wouldn't be able to do that if you don't have the basics. In fact, going into deep powder for somebody who has not experienced before can be terrifying because it feels like you're getting sucked down a lot of the time. Anyways, so I've been skiing for 26 years. 4 years ago, I still would have been skiing for a long time. Ellen and I went and visited some of our friends who were up in British Columbia. So we went to Whistler Ski Resort, where they were in transition between moving from Oregon to Colorado, and we're spending 2 months up at Whistler. Those lucky punks. So we went up to visit them, and we spent about a week skiing with them. It was fantastic. Had some really great snow. So the second day that we're there, or it may have been the first day actually, Kevin, my friend Kevin, says to me, "Hey, I want to take you down this run that I really love." And I, of course, say, "Yeah, let's go." Keep in mind, Ellen had only been skiing seriously for maybe 4 years, and was getting really good. She's a pretty good skier. She's much more cautious than I am. But she said, "No thanks. This sounds intimidating. I'll go up and I'll meet you at the bottom of the lift." So Kevin and his wife Carolyn and I, we go up the lift, and Kevin says, "Well, to get there, we have to go this way." And what he means by this way is we have to go what seems like a wrong direction. Okay, that is usually your first clue that you're getting into troubled waters, so to speak. So he takes us over. We traverse all the way across this hill, up over this kind of ridge, and he says, "Okay, you're going to need to make sure that you stop right there." And he kind of points ahead, which was great advice, because we stop, and I realize that what we're at is we're overlooking a cornice. So a cornice is where you've got a sharp ridge, and the snow kind of laps over the edge of that ridge, due to the nature and the property of snow and wind and all that. Cornices can be extremely dangerous, especially in the world of mountaineering. Cornices cause very many injuries and death because you oftentimes don't know that they're there, and they can break off. Now, what happened in this case is that this was a regular run that people did, and so there was this cornice, but there was a spot at which people had knocked the cornice off and were dropping down into a bowl, into a kind of like a scooped out part of the hill. So Kevin takes us up to the edge of this cornice, and he says, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to drop in here, and then there's this beautiful hollowed out bowl, tons of fresh powder in there. It's one of my favorite runs." He said, "But make sure as soon as you drop in that you turn left, because otherwise you'll go off the cliff." You can see where this is going, right? So here is a moment where you need to be able to do the things that are required to make turns, to navigate terrain. And you cannot be sitting there going, "Okay, plant your pole, turn around the pole, make sure," you can't be going through that process. You need to be able to do these things in the spur of the moment with fluidity and confidence, right? Because otherwise you're going to overthink it and you're going to go off the cliff. So Kevin skis right up, drops in. I look down. He's on his way. He's cruising through, having fun. Meanwhile, Carolyn, his wife, and I are sitting there watching him. And I'm like, "Okay, Carolyn, you've done this before. You go next." Well, Carolyn gets up to the edge. She tries to ease her way into it, which was the wrong move, and ends up getting one ski over the lip of this cliff, essentially, and changes her mind. And I end up pulling her back up. And we're both sitting there looking at each other like, there's no way in hell we're doing this. And then all of a sudden, somebody comes screaming through, doesn't even slow down, jumps off the edge of this cliff, drops in, and proceeds to ski down. And we look at each other again. We're like, "Well, guess we got to go now." So Carolyn drops through. I listen for, screaming and the sound of broken bones. She makes it through okay. And so then I'm like, well, nothing for it. Point my skis over. Boom, go in. First turn was pretty rough, but by the second turn, my muscles remembered what they needed to do, and I had a blast going down. Okay, this is what life is like in a lot of scenarios, but I think this is what Paul is advocating for. This is what Paul is talking about when he's talking about when you no longer need a pedagogue, when you transition into operating under faith operating under the umbrella of following Christ, what it means to be a disciple of Christ, what it means to be a Christian, and as he says, what it means to be baptized into Christ, to be clothed with Christ. Number one, it means that you have transcended, or you have gone past these set of simple rules, right? To the extent that you can choose when and how to apply them. But even more than that, you know when they no longer bear relevance, okay? And this is important. This is important to be able to move into this space, because that is what is required to navigate the world of adulthood and maturity. And I'm not just talking about physical adulthood and physical maturity. I'm talking more about what it means to be mature in the life of being a Christian, being a disciple. Yes, we have rules that we grew up with. And I know for many of you, especially many of you who grew up in a different generation, a different era than I did, that your rules of Christianity are different than the ones that I grew up with, right? I grew up in an era where childhood communion was a normal thing. And I know that was a big deal for a lot of people. I grew up in an era where having a female pastor was not a big deal. That was normal. And I know that for many of you, that was a big deal when women were able to be ordained. I know that was a learning experience for many of you, and it still may be something that you struggle with from time to time. I lived through the era when it suddenly, not suddenly, but I lived through the era when our church changed its mind about ordaining openly gay and lesbian people, about fully embracing GLBTQ clergy, right? And I can remember with stark contrast the before and the after. And I experienced many people having those really tough conversations about, well, but here are the rules as we understood them. What Paul seems to be saying here is that the law is well and good. It serves a purpose, right? It guides us during this time of our lives and this time of our faith where we need to learn to internalize and navigate by these rules to the point where they become part of our muscle memory. And they're important, right? Well, I don't think I need to get into why rules are important for childhood development, right? So you don't burn your hand off, right? Or drink the poison or do any of the things that you're not supposed to do, okay? But there is a point in everyone's lives, everyone's experience, where you need to be able to operate independent of those rules. It's not that you forget them, but you need to be able to navigate on your own cliffs, unexpected trees, unexpected hazards. And if you're sitting there trying to operate by these same, well, but I'm supposed to do this, this, and this, you're not going to be flexible or nimble enough to be able to do that. Not only that, what Paul seems to be saying here as well is that many of the rules that we grow up with are not rules that are compatible with Christ, that are compatible with the reign of Christ. He's talking to two communities here. He's talking to a Gentile community and a Jewish community that are in conflict. That's what the letter of Galatians is about. And they're both yelling at each other about the different rules that they were raised up with. The Jews are sitting there yelling at the Gentiles saying, but you need to be circumcised. You need to follow all these cleanliness laws. There are things that you can't eat. And the Gentiles are sitting there yelling, but none of you have been educated the way that you're supposed to be educated. None of you are, full citizens of your society. You all don't do work on Fridays and Saturdays. You don't participate in the army. You don't follow the rules that I grew up with. Right? There is a point at which our rules begin to hamper us, begin to hold us back. And some of the rules that we grew up with, even religious rules, I would argue, are no longer applicable and can even be harmful. It can be harmful in understanding this very important part of what it means to be a mature Christian, which is understanding the universality of being a child of God, which is that all created beings are children of God. That is one of the first things that you learn in transcending your childhood of faith and moving into a mature understanding of following Christ. The Galatians are learning this thing right now. So when Paul says to them, there is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, Paul is saying you need to be able to move into this new place where those things are no longer applicable. You are all children of God, and therefore these categories, these rules that you grew up with, you need to leave those behind. You need to set them aside and be able to navigate, to be nimble in this new reality, which is the reality of following Christ. This is great news for us. This is wonderful news for us. It's also a challenge for us as well, too. Because for those of you who have mastered a skill, you also know that and have experienced that you sometimes forget. You sometimes lose that natural ability. I haven't been skiing for 2 years, since the start of COVID. I don't know what it's going to be like when I hop on my skis for the first time next winter. I imagine that first day is going to be pretty rough, and I'm going to need to go back to my basics. Excuse me. I'm going to need to go back to plant the pole, pivot around the pole, make sure your weight's on downhill ski, keep your knees flexed, keep your shoulders pointed downhill. All of those things which I thought that I had transcended. And this is, one of the realities of being a Christian as well, too, is that sometimes we need to go back to those basic rules. Love your neighbor as yourself. Treat each other with kindness. Whichever set of rules you need to go back to. But they are with the purpose of being able to move back to transcending that rule set, of navigating nimbly the world of following Jesus. And in that world of following Jesus, the only rule that exists is that we're all children of God, regardless of category, regardless of the rules that we grew up with, regardless of all the things that we think may have applied at some point in time. That is the only rule that holds true in this, that under the rule of faith, all people are redeemed through Christ. All right, that's enough for today. Hope you're all doing well. Thank you for your prayers and your concern. I'll be fine. I'll probably be sick as a dog tomorrow and Tuesday and be back up at it. You should hear from me hopefully prior to, I'm going to say Thursday, as to what the plans are for next Sunday. Like I said, I suspect that we're going to have to do something alternate. The responsible thing for me to do is not show up on Sunday, even though I might feel fine. Okay. Blessings to you on your week, and may God be with you in the week ahead.